Plato, the famous Greek philosopher against democracy, once created a tale that could be used as an allegory of a once great civilization suddenly disappearing from one day to the next due of their greed and corruption. Of course, I'm talking about the tale that comes from two of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. Plato presents the story as a historical account passed down from ancient Egyptian priests to the Athenian statesman Solon, who then relayed it through generations until it reached Critias, one of the characters in the dialogues. According to Plato, Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we now associate with the Strait of Gibraltar, meaning somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean just outside the Mediterranean. He describes it as a massive island larger than Libya and Asia Minor or Anatolia combined. Atlantis was ruled by 10 kings, all descended from Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. Poseidon divided the island into 10 parts, each ruled by one of his sons. The Atlanteans were wealthy, powerful, and advanced, masters of agriculture, architecture, and seafaring. Their navy was immense, and their armies vast. However, over time their morals decayed, and they became corrupt, seeking to conquer beyond their borders without justification, including Egypt and Athens. The Atlanteans waged war against the ancient Athenians, described by Plato as a virtuous prehistoric society that defended itself and its allies without help. And against all odds, Athens defeated Atlantis, showing superior virtue and courage, and also a lot of plot armor. Shortly after the war, Atlantis faced divine punishment, and according to Plato, in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. Of course, all of this doesn't have a real historical accuracy, being purely fictional by any means. And even if the island really once existed, Plato places the events of Atlantis 9,000 years before his own time, which would make the Atlanteans existing as a civilization almost around the year 10,000 BCE, a time that predates all known human civilizations like the Sumerians or ancient Egypt, which again is highly impossible. But ironically, there is something from those times that has to some extent some true in it, which is also a very famous event of the Old Testament, the Great Flood. Of course, in reality that didn't happen due of a divine punishment, but just by the natural consequences of the Earth warming up rapidly during the last stage of our most recent ice age, which submerged several very important pieces of land around the planet. For example, Australia was at that moment fused with Papua New Guinea, making the massive continent of Sahul, or the British Isles were not always disconnected from Europe. They were once connected to the rest of the continent by a massive piece of extra land between them called the Doggerland. But then eventually around the 10,000s BCE happened what we could call a realistic Great Flood, when finally the continents adopted more or less the shapes that we are all familiar with today. I can't even imagine how much of a traumatic and changing event that Great Flood was for the humans that survived those horrible times to be alive. It was something so impactful that they transferred those stories orally to their descendants during thousands of years, until the tale was so distorted from the actual facts that by the point when writing was invented, it became more a mythical tale than an historical event. And all the civilizations wrote their own interpretation of this distorted memory until it became purely fiction. And it is in one of those distorted interpretations that I think Plato got his idea of Atlantis, using the planetary impact on humanity of this extremely ancient Great Flood in order to write his work of the Atlanteans. Now what if we ignore the climatic and planetary consequences of having an extra giant piece of land on Earth, and we assume that the rest of the conditions of every part of the planet stays the same? What if Atlantis existed? That's what we are going to see today. First of all, we are of course eliminating all the mythical, divine, or magical aspects of the Atlanteans. They will not be Poseidon's descendants, just normal humans that, just like the rest of our ancestors, took advantage of the lower level of the sea at some point in our story, in order to reach Atlantis before it became an individual giant island, and that's it. However, we are going to assume that the island was exceptionally lucky to not be affected by the Ice Age in the same way as the rest of the world, that the lands there were extremely rich in all the resources that humans needed in order to develop civilization. Thanks to that fact, the first Atlanteans would have been able to become an agricultural culture thousands of years before any other group of human on the planet, becoming sedentary very early in our prehistory, and in consequence building a civilization thousands of years before anyone else on Earth. That would give them a huge advantage in all the ways we can imagine. Let's just say this process of sedentarization starts around 20,000 BCE for them. That would give them 10,000 years of time in order to become the civilization that Plato described originally. Eventually, the first small civilizations would start, with many different city-states being created, at first all of them being separated, then unified across multiple small states that would become the 10 kingdoms that Plato talked about, until eventually, after another thousands of years, they would all finally unified into a huge empire, the first in all of human history, which would be around 10,000 BCE, just like Plato said. And after all of that, like any young empire in its prime, they would want to conquer other territories beyond their borders, and as a continent, but also an island, they would have no other choice than expanding beyond their seas by conquering lands from both sides of their island. Because yes, Plato mentions that Atlanteans conquered lands beyond both sides of their island, which means that ironically, that will also include the Americas in this story, even if Plato didn't say that on purpose, of course. Can you just imagine the face of the prehistoric humans watching from their coasts, arriving hundreds of fleets arriving from nowhere, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers with armors of iron and steel, and with tens or maybe hundreds of war elephants? Because yes, Plato also says that there were elephants on the island. I can imagine around those times when Atlantis becomes a unified empire that, ignoring all the magical aspects of their myths, they would have at least a technological level comparable to the Roman Empire at their peak, maybe even a little bit more by the time they start conquering other places around the 10,000s BCE. So, after a few hundreds of years, the Atlanteans would have conquered easily at bare minimum all the coastlines of Western Europe, Western Africa, and Eastern North, Center, and South America. However, the colonization of those lands will be quite slow by the main Atlanteans because around those times there were at best around 10 million humans on the entire Earth, so no many potential slaves or even people to just civilize yet. But I have no doubt that with time, more and more Atlanteans will eventually move to their colonies, due to the fact that it is unlikely that such an advanced civilization would not have, ironically by this point, more humans on their island than there were on the rest of the world in our timeline. If we take, for example, the height of the Roman Empire from our timeline, their population during the 2nd century would have been around 70 million. So let's just assume that at least at bare minimum, Atlantis would have been populated by around 35 million by the time they reached their golden age by conquering all those new colonies. That will force the small group of conquered humans to accept their new leaders without revolts, because they will simply not be enough humans there in the first place in order to revolt, plus because the Atlanteans would be literally the first civilization in the world. In this timeline, the Neolithic humans would not have any idea of what type of treatment in a civilized and urbanized system was fair or not for them, because they would not have any point of comparison with other civilizations or other time period in their non-written history, and that's why I think the control of the Atlanteans for now would be absolute and uncontested by the small tribal groups of people living in their colonized territories. Besides, let's be real for a moment. Even though we now know that the process of civilization was not a welcome one by most of the humans at first, eventually the benefits and quality of life would be undeniable, and most people, and the new generation especially, would be glad to live in such a comfort and stable lifestyle, of course, compared to how they were living before, and probably that after having established themselves in their colonies and urbanized, or the places they were, the birth rate of the locals would increase massively, and with that, the population too, expanding the numbers of humans across the world, thousands of years earlier with all of those advances, that the Atlantean lifestyle would give to the Neolithic humans that would have accepted the rule of their new masters. But, after all of that, even after eventually urbanizing, civilizing, and using all the resources all of their territories they conquered, I don't think they will have too much, if not at all, more technological progress in their empire and culture, for the simple fact that because they had literally the entire hegemony on the civilization department in the entire world, they would not find any interest or genuine incentive to improve technologically, even after hundreds, if not thousands of years. Yeah, sure, they will make some practical improvements, like better roads for commerce, better ships for long-distance traveling the seas, but after having reached the bare minimum necessary in order to be as advanced as they need it to be in order to control their empire, they will stop to improve and stagnate almost indefinitely. I guess around the technological level that Europe in our reality had during and after the Renaissance, but before the Industrial Revolution, but without guns probably. But again, that would not be an issue without having enemies or other civilizations in the world to compete with them, so for a while, nothing wrong will go with them, for a very long while actually. So that's it, right? Atlanteans dominate absolutely all kinds of competition against the rest of humanity, and with time, eventually they conquer the entire world, right? Well, no. Sure, their dominance over the rest of humans would be unquestionable, if not forever, at least for a very long time, maybe even until these days in our timeline currently, but there's still something that will stop this from happening no matter what: Mother Nature. Because yes, even though we took away all the most fantastical or mythical aspects of Atlantis, there is still something that will happen: the real-life Great Flood. It will just be a normal consequence of thousands of years of global warming, and just like in our timeline, eventually places like the lands of Sahul or the Doggerland disappeared, it would also be the case of Atlantis in this alternate history, which would be happening around 8000 BCE. With this gigantic catastrophe of planetary scales, all of humanity would be deeply impacted by the literal collapse of the birthplace of civilization itself in this alternate timeline. But this would not mean the end of the Atlanteans as a people, because after thousands of years having a huge colonial empire, of course a lot of Atlanteans would have moved from their homeland to their colonies, just like it happened in our timeline with other great empires in our story. So culturally and genetically, Atlanteans would not have disappeared from the surface of Earth, but they would progressively not be the dominant people on their remaining lands, and after thousands of years of being assimilated and civilized by Atlanteans, they would definitely be capable of confronting and question the authority of the remaining Atlanteans, now that they were deprived of a central authority like the island of Atlantis was for them. And with that, slowly, very slowly, across hundreds, maybe another 1,000 years more after the submersion of Atlantis, little by little, the non-Atlanteans of their old colonies would start to revolt, or just take charges and control of the places they were just by pure population superiority. Because of course, after all this time being civilized and urbanized, the population of the old Neolithic humans would have increased massively, surpassing the Atlanteans at least in their colonies. And with that, eventually, their colonial empire would start to be divided among their local people until the total fragmentation of that empire would be acted. And with that, finally, the rest of those humans that were once conquered by Atlanteans would have a chance to define their own culture and legacy as their own civilization. But, of course, before that happened, an inevitable collapse would happen to these now new rulers of the old Atlantean Empire, having to adapt to the simple concept of civilization before to create their own, and just like the Dark Age of our timeline that Europeans experienced after the fall of the Roman Empire, they would also experience an extremely longer and painful Dark Age, where everything will go backwards for a long time, longer than in our timeline during Europe's Dark Age, maybe thousands of years even. But it doesn't matter in the long run, because no matter how long this Atlantean Dark Age would be, even with all of this time lost, their eventual renaissance would still happen centuries before even the oldest civilization in our timeline was founded in Mesopotamia. And with that, we could expect that with time, those new empires or kingdoms descending from the Atlantean Empire would have built their own legacy and legitimacy as true individual civilizations that would compete with each other and in consequence, finally improve and innovate in order to gain an advantage over their rivals or enemies. And just like in our timeline, there is not any European country, and beyond that is not influenced by the Greco-Roman legacy we all share, and in this alternate world, by the times the first pyramids would have been built in our timeline, there would not be any part of the world that would not be influenced in some way or another by the Atlantean legacy, even if eventually new civilizations rises like in our timeline. Maybe only the Chinese people would be far enough for the sphere of influence of the descendants of Atlanteans' cultures and powers in order to still create their own peculiar and unique civilization that we all know today, but that's definitely a stretch and just a very small possibility. And with all of that, no matter how long it takes to recover from the fall of the Atlanteans, something is certain: humanity by the time of what we would call the 21st century would be absolutely and completely different. Maybe we would have become by now a Type 1 civilization, maybe a Type 2 civilization, or maybe even a Type 3, who knows? Maybe our territories, technologies, and empires would be closer to our fiction than our actual reality, like Star Wars or Star Trek, but that, it's already too far in the future in order to make accurate assumptions, and any try from me to do it would be just pure fiction and an imagination exercise. So, I think this is the perfect place where to live this crazy and mostly fantastical alternate history. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. And without anything else to say, see you next time.